Vattimo's theory of truth. Franca de Agostini. In The End of Modernity, Gianni Vattimo suggests that truth should be seen in a rhetorical rather than logical perspective. Actually, what we call truth is the intersubjective agreement on some topics of common use. When we inquire into truth, we are in fact exploring the nature and extension of our agreement. In Beyond Interpretation and in Vocazione e Responsabilità del Filosofo, Vattimo points out that friendship is the foundation of truth. Aristotle's saying magis amica veritas should then be reversed. Friendship has a certain primacy over truth. In what follows, I examine Vattimo's particular version of combined pragmatism and coherentism, which significantly also combines Nietzsche's theory of nihilism and the Christian conception of pietas. Vattimo's view could be easily misunderstood. By associating truth and friendship, logic and rhetoric, he may be understood to assert the primacy of the latter over the former terms, yet it is not properly so. What I call Vattimo's theory of truth is based via Heidegger on the assumption of friendship as the context of relevance of truth. That is, there is no question of truth. We are not interested in agreement, or even if there is not a problem of agreement. Consequently, rhetoric, in a particular sense of it, is the correct perspective in the consideration of truth as a concept of philosophical analysis. Logical truth is based on constructed domains or worlds. Philosophical truth instead regards the truthful, friendly ways of constructing these domains or worlds. Anomalous coherentism. The fundamental goal of the reflection on nihilism and hermeneutic as developed in The End of Modernity is, as Vattimo openly declares, to open up a non-metaphysical conception of truth. This non-metaphysical conception is defined as based on art and rhetoric. In other words, our experience of truth is to be qualified as aesthetic and rhetorical. In this sense, non-metaphysical means not referring to a given conception of objective reality. When things are so stated, however, two specifications become necessary. First, the aesthetic and rhetorical nature of truth has nothing to do with subjective emotions and feelings. Conversely, truth is to be related to the historical stipulations that give form to what we consider as objectivity and that create a sort of substantiality. Sostanzialità is the Italian term significantly used here by Vattimo. Second, the intrinsically intersubjective status of truth is not to be confused with common sense. The passage to the domain of the true is not a simple passage to common sense. To identify in aesthetic experience the model of the experience of truth means also to accept that it has to do with something more. Aesthetic experience and common sense most frequently conflict. The former is a sort of shock. It implies an idea of knowledge as something that suddenly hits our usual views. The latter refers to the reassuring world of everyday truth, which is shared by all human beings and usually entails the awareness of this sharing. These preliminary points should be carefully taken into account in order to understand the exact nature of Vattimo's point of view. 1 can easily see that here Vattimo implicitly accepts a coherentist theory of truth, but with some significant differences. First, truth is seen in the perspective of experience, that is as it is implied by the phenomenological Heideggerian perspective, that what we are going to do is not to give a definition of truth as a property of sentences or propositions, but properly to explain or describe the experience of truth. Such an experience is not to be linked to science but to art, that is the reception and the production or creation of art. Second, the set of truths K, that is the set of knowledges in which we can test the coherence of a single proposition in order to state its truth, is not a fixed set. Rather, it has a historical nature. This means that it is somehow substantial insofar as it is intersubjectively fixed, but it is at the same time it is also moving and flowing. Some contemporary versions of coherentism and the various mixtures of coherentism and pragmatism from time to time proposed in the 20th century from Charles Sanders Peirce have admitted of some sort of dynamic vision. Vattimo's view is to be included within such versions. Yes. What is puzzling and I think most important in Vattimo's view is, however, something rather unexpected, namely the inclusion of the concept and practice of nihilism in the scenario. In other words, Vattimo grounds his historical coherentism on nihilism and openly shows how the former is a sort of natural consequence of the latter. One ought to be a historical coherentist insofar as one ought to be a nihilist. Coherentism and nihilism. The point from which to start is the notion of complete, fulfilled nihilism. True nihilism is self-contradictory. This is an obvious idea which was well known to the ancient Greeks and which has been repeatedly and variously mentioned by the contemporary critics of nihilism. One cannot assert the non-existence of truth without implying at the same time that such a claim should be in some sense true. One cannot say that every proposition is false without self-contradiction. That is, without either assuming that there is at least one true proposition, namely every proposition is false, b. assuming that also this same proposition is false. So simply stated, if there is no truth is true, it is false, and if it is false, it is false. The proposition something is true is like logicians are accustomed to saying, and is its own truth. Nietzsche himself is in some sense aware of this fact, given his intense and detailed knowledge of ancient philosophy. He knows that in principle there are two forms of epistemological nihilism. Truth, one may admit that the non-existence of truth is true. In other words, one may say that there is no truth and that this is true, or else there is no truth and even this is not true. The former corresponds to what Nietzsche calls incomplete nihilism. The latter corresponds to complete nihilism.